Hello, friends, and welcome back to episode 4 of Scattered Thoughts, a mini-cast where we talk about whatever in the world of Magic the Gathering we feel like talking about for the day. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm hosting Scattered Thoughts today, and the question on our mind for today's mini-cast is, white good in Commander again? So let's put a little context here for people who maybe aren't long-term Commander players or just dabble with the format. There has been this narrative for the last 4-5 years, maybe even longer than that, that white is just the obvious last place color in Magic the Gathering, especially in Commander. It's almost farcical at this point when a new set comes out and a pretty middling white rare is spoiled during preview season, and all the comments are like, well, Wizards of the Coast never gives white anything, this is what white does. And we want to kind of explore if that's changed in the last couple years or maybe even just this year. First things first, I want to address the history of white over the last few years and see if there actually was a problem with white, if it really was last place in Commander, or if that was just the, de facto Magic players complain about whatever they can complain about, right? After we look at kind of the history, we want to kind of catch up to modern day and see what white is doing now, if it's caught up to the other colors, if there was an issue in the first place, and see just kind of how it stands from my point of view compared to the other colors. And then I do want to close out the video by just kind of rattling off a few of the bangers in white that make it a viable color in Commander once we've kind of come to a conclusion on where it stands versus the other colors. But that all starts with the question, was white really that bad? And the answer, as always, is a little bit more complicated than just a yes or no answer. If I had to give a yes or no to the question, was white really that bad in Commander, I would probably say yes. Besides a few standout cards, which were in fact really good, white's like top 5 to 10 EDH cards, white didn't really get new things for a long time there. And to kind of put it in perspective, I'm kind of a casual EDH player. I've been playing since 2012. And I would say from 2012 all the way up to like 2018, 19, maybe even 2020, there was not a lot of shift in white's Magic philosophy in the color pie and what white would do. And a lot of what white actually does not translate into games of EDH particularly well. It works perfectly fine for Constructed and Limited, but in a Commander setting where you are doubling the number of opponents that you have, tripling the number of opponents you have, doubling everybody's life total, some of the things that white does in the color pie just don't stand up in a multiplayer game. So for example, life gain is something that is primary in white, and life gain as a strategy does not necessarily translate into EDH particularly well when your life total is already very high, when people can kill you with combos where your life doesn't matter. I'm not saying life doesn't matter at all in EDH, but as a strategy, it's kind of a casual thing. It doesn't really stand up to a lot of what other people are doing in a multiplayer format. It's also worth noting that in EDH, green and black can do the life gain thing as well. Green has creature-based life gain, and black has, payment for life, lifelink creatures, stuff like that. So it's not even really something that white gets to do on its own. And I would say the black payoffs for gaining life, Sanguine Bod, Veto, stuff like that, Exquisite Blood, these are better versions of what the white life gain cards do anyway. White does tokens. White is basically the primary color for tokens, which is a real strategy. If we're talking about like small ball creatures and stuff like that, tokens is a viable thing, but not something that white can do by itself. Green can do tokens. Pretty much every color can do tokens now. White's card draw was always tied to small creatures, and I think this was one of the things that really made it stand out, or at least it was a negative that standed out for white, is that it would not have a lot of card draw options unless it was tied to token making and things like that. So think Mentor of the Meek and Bygone Bishop, and we've got better versions of these cards that we'll talk about today, but Mentor of the Meek kind of lasted as one of white's card draw options for a very long time, and it's not particularly good. Fight me on that one. I know there are some diehards for Mentor of the Meek, but 3 mana 2/2, whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, you can pay a mana to draw a card. That's not great when you're investing your mana into something when other players get to do that thing for free, right? Other people get to play creatures like, just for example, Beast Whisper, the 4 mana 2/3, whenever you cast a creature, draw a card. Like, the draw options in other colors were so much better than white that it was really hard for white to keep up in terms of card advantage with other colors. So I think that was one of the main issues, and it definitely was an issue. Other things white can do, auras and equipment were very centered in white and still are. We see the Boros equipment deck pop up quite often. Again, there's kind of this long-standing thought that Voltron decks and equipment decks are like tier 2, tier 3. They're not highly competitive. There are ways to make them competitive, but for the average Commander player, invest in all of your time and effort in a game into equipping things up and suiting things up with auras. Usually backfires when somebody makes you sack your board or wraths a board or something like that. It's kind of an all-in, chickens in one basket, eggs in one basket strategy that doesn't really lead to the most competitive Commander gameplay. And we just mentioned it, wraths. White is one of the primary colors for wraths as well. And I would say that wraths have gotten worse over time. Not the quality of the wraths themselves, but as a game plan, just wrath in the board has become a little bit worse than it used to be. It's still something you want. You still want sweepers in EDH, obviously. I wouldn't leave home without at least 1 or 2 sweepers in most of my decks. But there are so many more ETB effects and value effects and resilient creatures with indestructible and stuff like that. There are ways to get around wraths where you're not just going to Wrath of God and then it's smooth sailing from there, right? So wraths are still good. It's something that white does, but it has dropped off a little bit in my estimation. So with all that said, something that is notably missing there, we've already mentioned card draw, but ramp. White does not do the ramp thing, and we have seen white ramp cards. There's like Core Cartographer, which is a 4-mana 2/2 that enters the battlefield and fetches up a plains. There's Knight of the White Orchid, which can do the same thing if your opponents are ahead on lands. White does have ramp options, but they're pretty few and far between. If you're playing against a bunch of green players, they're always going to have more lands than you as a white player, and we'll see whether that's still true or not, but that is one of the long-standing problems that white has had. If you think about it, EDH is kind of ruled by card advantage and ramp. Those are kind of the two big things, mana and cards, and white is like a last place at doing both of those things. Now, white has ramp options, like we said, but they've always had this kind of philosophy of playing catch-up as their ramp option. In fact, that's been a thing since Alpha, right? If you think of land tax, which is an excellent card, it only triggers if your opponents have more lands than you, and that's kind of white's philosophy. That's what white does, is play the catch-up game. If your opponents have more of a resource than you, you get to do a thing where you can catch up, but you can see how that's kind of a problem. It never lets you get ahead of the opponents. It only lets you get up to parity, or you have to be behind. And white cards to this day still do that. There are a lot better options nowadays in terms of ramp and card draw, but for a long time, white didn't have that, and I think it took this intentional outcry from EDH players that, hey, white sucks, white can't do this, white can't do that, to really get R&D's attention. And of course, when R&D starts hearing stuff like that, the sets where they start implementing things like that don't get released for another 1.5 2 years, 2.5 years. So I think we are now in the modern day seeing the fixes that R&D tried to implement when they started hearing these complaints a couple years ago. I think if we move out of the scope of EDH for just a second, there's also something else that really tied into this narrative that white just sucked and was the worst color, and that's how white was performing in limited sets for a couple sets straight. If you look back to War of the Spark, if you look back to Core Set 2020, if you look back to Modern Horizons 1, that was a stretch of sets that all came out back to back to back where white was very obviously the worst color in the set. Now, obviously, being the worst color in Limited and being the worst color in Commander are two completely different things, but when you get that many sets in a row where white is just noticeably worse and it's doing the same thing in and out every single set by making tokens and having a couple evasive creatures and a couple, white weenie strategies and pump spells and stuff like that, and it's just not working, it becomes obvious that you need to kind of change the direction that white is going and broaden what white can do in order to make it a contender. So you have this narrative that white sucks in Limited. You have this narrative that White sucks in Commander. It's clearly the worst of the 5 colors. You combine that together, and people start to just say, white is a terrible color. Magic the Gathering, you need to do something about that. It doesn't help that around 2020 was the same time that we were starting to get, like, in my estimation, these just absurd value commanders that didn't include white. Things like Yarok and Muldrotha and Urza and Golos. These things that very clearly were pushing design in the space of, hey, these are broken commanders. We're releasing more and more broken commanders. And white did not have a lot to go along with that. It was very funny when something like Throne of Eldraine came out and we got a cycle of legendary monocolored creatures that were supposed to be able to be played at the forefront of their own deck and give you a powerful incentive to be monocolored. And you would get something like Ayara, First of Locthwain, which is the triple black creature that drains your opponent when creatures come into play, can sack creatures to draw cards. There was Torbrand, the 4-mana 2/4 that makes all of your red stuff deal way more damage. And then the white one was like Linden, which was a 3-mana 3/3 that gained you life whenever a creature attacked. It's almost just laughable at that point when your headlining mono white creature is just something trashy and doesn't do anything new that white couldn't already do, while the other colors are getting more things that expand what their colors are doing. We would see this time and time again, and I think it just led to a lot of frustration in the EDH community about white just not having a viable place at most tables if people were going to play a lot of the more modern strategies and broken commanders and things like that. So, let's go to modern day here. Has that issue been solved? Is white still very clearly last place, or has it been taking steps to get better? Well, again, you're listening to Scattered Thoughts. This is all my opinion, so I would love to hear your opinion on it. But if you ask me, I think white's in a pretty good place right now. And I know people love to have their superlatives. They love to say, this is the best color, this is the best color, this is the worst color. But I think things are pretty mellowed out at the moment where there's not a color that's so clearly better than the rest. I think white has caught up to a point where everything's fairly even with maybe some ebbs and flows between individual cards. And a lot of that is because white has caught up and white can now do a lot of the things that it couldn't previously do, and a lot of its strategies have gotten better over time. I think if we look specifically to last year around the time that Modern Horizons 2 came out and the 2 Innistrad sets, Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow, we started to see kind of the payoff that Wizards of the Coast had been designing for the last year or two after hearing all of these commander complaints, and we started getting things that filled the holes that white couldn't do. White's removal got way better. White's interaction has gotten way better. White can now draw cards, which we'll talk about a couple of those cards. Even white's aggressive creatures, which is a strategy that's well known to be below the bar for commander, aggression has gotten a lot better, and an aggro strategy can actually work out now for white, whereas before it just kind of folded to a sweeper or a cyclonic rift or something along those lines. You can actually put pressure on people in combat now, which is something I think EDH was missing consistently for a long time. So when I think back to last year and this current year and what it has offered white to kind of catch up, I'm thinking about things like Solitude and Prismatic Endin, which are good interactive pieces. There's now Sarah's Emissary and Legion Loyalty, which are finisher type cards in the same vein as Elish Norn. Elish Norn has always been a great white card, but it's kind of been top tier for a long time because there's just nothing else that really compares to it in white. And there now is. Sarah's Emissary does a pretty good job at closing things out and protecting your board. Legion Loyalty is new. That's the enchantment that gives all of your creatures Myriad, but it is kind of this fun, cool overrun effect that is also quite powerful in creature-heavy decks. When we talk about aggression, the first card that comes to mind is Adeline, Resplendent Cathar. I have a very love-hate relationship with this card. It is just super, super powerful. This is the 1 white X4 with power equal to the number of creatures you control, and whenever you attack, you send a new 1/1 creature at each of your opponents. It stacks up damage really, really fast, and a turn 2 or turn 3 in Adeline can just close out games super fast if unchecked. In terms of card draw, we got to pick up Welcome in Vampire, which, if I had to put a pin on an exact card that made me think, oh, white gets to draw cards now, it is Welcome in Vampire. That was kind of the first card that stood out to me as this is a white card doing what white wants to do and does it very well. It's basically an upgrade in almost every way to Mentor of the Meek, and again, people will refute that, but if you play Mentor of the Meek in an average game, I think Welcome in Vampire is just so obviously better. It's the 2/3 flyer for 3 mana. Whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card, but it only triggers once per turn. You can trigger it on all of your opponent's turns as well if you can make tokens and stuff like that. Just card draw attached to creature generation without additional mana investment is very, very powerful, especially on an evasive body, something that can, steal the Monarch or the Initiative, something that can fly over, blocks decently, has a relevant creature type being a vampire. Just a very, very solid card, and one that stands out with an asterisk to me as a defining card that shifts white into a contender for the format rather than something that's lagging behind. I will say, too, that some of the things that white has traditionally done have gotten better over time, like the Banisher Priest type effect. The creatures that come down and exile something until they leave the battlefield. Skyclave Shade and Brutal Cathar are in the card pool now, and those are just way better versions of Banisher Priest that we've seen in the past. And, of course, there are all the powerhouse cards that we're going to talk about that set white above the other colors. Things that white has that other colors wish they had or have equivalent versions of. So why don't we go ahead and talk about some of white's just absolute best cards. The top of the top, the cards that make you want to play white, or at least the staple cards that you're probably including in most of your white decks if you have a copy, and these are things that other colors don't necessarily get. So first thing that comes to mind, Swords to Plowshares. 1 white mana for an instant, exile a creature. Its controller gains life equal to that creature's power. Still the best point and click 1-for-1 removal spell in the format. Maybe there's an argument for some other card out there, but I still think Swords to Plowshare gets the easy nod for best single target removal spell. White has also picked up Farewell in Neo Kamigawa this year, which is one of the best sweepers in the format. It's 4 white for a sorcery. You choose 1 or more, exile all artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and graveyards. Very similar to Merciless Eviction, but it hits as many modes as you want. Notably, it can't hit planeswalkers, but it can hit multiple things, and it does nuke everybody's graveyard. This is just one of the best reset buttons in the entire game. It gets around all of those resilient things that I said make the Wraths a little bit weaker these days, by comparison to something like Cyclonic Rift, which probably is the best sweeper in the format. This just permanently deals with stuff. Your opponent doesn't get to then deploy it. It catches all those treasure tokens that are getting out of hand. It is just one of the most backbreaking removal spells, or rather one of the most backbreaking sweepers in the format, and it just gets white at that point where they can catch back up if they need to. If things have gotten out of control, this card just deals with pretty much everything except the pesky planeswalkers and kind of puts everybody on even footing again for the game. White still has Teferi's Protection, which has always been, since its printing, one of the best cards in the format. Just point blank, not even best white card, but just one of the best cards in the game. It is the best protection spell in the entire game because it just almost guarantees you can't die. There's almost nothing your opponents can do besides incidentally mill you and things like that. The turn that you cast Teferi's Protection, a lot of times games come down to whether or not somebody's holding Teferi's Protection or not, and of course you can craft your own game plans around it. Very, very powerful card on the same level as Heroic Intervention and the really good protection spells, but even better than those. This has been something that White has had since, I want to say, Teferi's Protection was printed in 2016, 2017, something like that. Whenever they brought phasing back, for whatever reason they did that for, this card has just been phenomenal and has definitely withstood the narrative that white is bad and so on and so forth. Along those same lines, Smother and Tithe, the enchantment that makes a treasure token whenever an opponent draws a card unless they do not pay 2 mana. This has been, since its inception into the format, one of the, big grown cards of the format. Very reminiscent of Rhystic Study, but kind of does the thing that you want in white that Rhystic Study does in blue, right? Rhystic Study draws you a bunch of cards. Smother and Tithe gains you a bunch of extra mana, and we said just a couple minutes ago that mana and cards are the 2 things that you want in EDH, so Smother and Tithe has the potential on its own to just generate all the extra mana you'll need for a game, even if it does kind of make you a target in the game. Very powerful ramp spell, and something that white has that other colors don't really have an equivalent to. We've already mentioned land tax, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but that's still one of the best cards in the game at just making sure that you hit land drops, making sure that you find the appropriate colors of mana. It is a little bit indicative of the quote-unquote white has to play catch-up game plan. It's one of the predecessor cards for establishing that white does that, but it is still a very powerful card at just drawing you extra action throughout a game, even though that action is always in the form of basic lands, and making sure that you never get mana screwed for a game. Along those same lines, there's Archaeomancer's map now, which I think came out with the Strixhaven Commander decks back in like 2020, 2021. I don't remember when Strixhaven came out. Whenever that came out, we got Archaeomancer's map, which is just an excellent card. It's burgeoning for people who love burgeoning, but it gets you those 2 planes right when it enters the battlefield, so it gets your action going. It makes sure that you are participating in the game, and it lets you hit those extra land drops, which is not something that white gets to do very easily. I think, I don't have the card directly in front of me, but I think Archaeomancer's map still says that you only get to put a land into play if your opponents have more lands than you, so it's not exactly a strictly better burgeoning or anything like that, but it is a very powerful card that white has that other colors do not. A couple creatures worth mentioning that we would be remiss not to mention here. Esper Sentinel. A lot of people claim this is the best white card in EDH right now, and I think there's probably an argument for that. Esper Sentinel is the single white mana 1/1 human. It's an artifact creature, and whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, you draw a card unless they pay mana equal to Esper Sentinel's power. So base level, it taxes them, or they have to pay a mana for their first non-creature spell each turn, or you get to just draw cards. And an early Esper Sentinel has the same kind of groan reaction that Rhystic Study does without being as problematic, right? Rhystic Study, you can't just pay for every single thing. Eventually people will draw a card off of it. But Esper Sentinel, you can kind of pay for it. At some point you might stop paying for it. It's just a very well-rounded card, very cheap, easy to get on board. It is one of white's most powerful draw options and can draw you a bunch of extra cards throughout the course of a game. It is also worth noting, if you can pump Esper Sentinel's power, your opponents actually have to pay more mana. So if you can stick this with a bunch of equipment or something like that, it could actually get out of hand and draw you a bunch of cards, and then your opponents will be angry at you. There's also 2 cards that we got recently. I think they were both in Baldur's Gate or the Baldur's Gate precons, and those are Archivist of Ogma and Deep Gnome Terramancer. The Archivist is a 2-mana 2/2 flash. Whenever an opponent searches their library, you gain a life and draw a card. That happens a lot throughout the course of a game. You can do it in response to like a fetch land or a cultivate or a solemn simulacrum, and you just get to get in on the draw action. The extra incidental life gain is not bad either. And then there's Deep Gnome Terramancer, which is another 2-mana 2/2 flash, and whenever an opponent has a land enter the battlefield and they didn't play it, you get to go search up a land. And that one's notable because that doesn't have the catch-up clause on it. You can do that anytime your opponent fulfills the condition, which, again, if they just crack a fetch land and put it into play, or they cast a cultivate or a solemn simulacrum that is putting a land into play without playing it, you get to go get a land as well and put it into play tapped. I think these are 2 cards that really show what white is doing these days and trying to break from the mold in terms of giving white some options to draw cards and keep up with card advantage throughout the game and get extra lands into play and potentially be able to ramp to the same point that other colors are able to do. Last quick white card on this list, Akroma's Will came out in Commander Legends, the first Commander Legends set a couple years ago, and I think that card just ends the game every single time I see it, so I thought I would mention it here. I'm not going to read the whole card, but it's like 4 mana for a sorcery. It might be an instant, I don't know. Gives your creatures a bunch of abilities, and if you control a commander, it gives them like even more abilities. It's just this massive overrun type effect that gives them all double strike, lifelink, trample, protection from colors, and just very, very often either ends the game if you have a board of creatures or stabilizes because you just get this massive lifelink swing against your opponents. It is probably worth noting here, this isn't attributed to any individual card or anything like that, but the equipment theme that we mentioned has also been strengthened over time. It feels like they just went set after set after set of making the red-white color pair a Boros equipment deck, and because of that, we would get a card here or a card there that would add to the equipment theme. like really effective, efficient equipment and good ways to get those equipment attached to creatures to make that type of strategy actually viable without being a complete gimmick. And we still get more of this from set to set. Equipment and auras are on the upswing these days. They are viable strategies in Commander. They're not just gimmicks or tier 2, tier 3 decks like they used to be. There's a lot of options, and I think White being able to build out the themes that it naturally has always had is a good thing. So I would like to see more of this in the future, and it looks like we are getting more of this. In fact, Dominaria United is on its way in here in a couple days, and we've already seen like the new Danitha, which can auto-equip an equipment from your graveyard and stuff like that. So we will see more of these equipment strategies. It's branching out into a bunch of other colors as well, so I wouldn't be surprised if we see equipment be kind of like an all-star permanent type moving forward down the line. So we just named a bunch of cards that make White really good. We've named a bunch of kind of best in-class cards. Farewell, one of the best sweepers. Smother and Tithe, one of the best ways to ramp. Teferi's Protection, one of the best protection spells. Esper Sentinel, one of the best repeatable card draw spells. That's a lot of best ofs in a color that's supposedly the worst. And I don't think the narrative's ever going to go away, because it's so deep-seated in some people's brains that White sucks, White is terrible, it only does small creatures, it loses to Wraths, it can't ramp, it can't draw cards. These are kind of the things people have been saying, and every time we get a set that doesn't immediately offer something really crazy and new to White, but another color gets something that's really good, people bring that narrative back up. And if you're not already guessed, I haven't explicitly stated my opinion, but yes, I think White is a viable color in Commander. I do not think it's last place. I think at very worst it's tied with a couple other colors for whatever we would consider last place. But again, there's kind of this narrowing of the colors to the point where everything's kind of viable. The top contenders are now a lot closer to where the worst contenders were, and everything's kind of in the middle. White has definitely caught up to where it needs to be be a viable color in Commander, and I think it actually has some of the most powerful cards that you can play in the format. So yes, White is good again. White is fine. If you ask me, White was always fine, but it was clearly last place, whereas other people, had the kind of perspective that you couldn't play White at all. You just could not have a competitive deck if you were playing White. I don't think that was ever particularly true, but I think it's very clear now that White has a lot of contention in terms of its power and what you can build. You don't have to feel like you're automatically behind because you put together a White Commander deck. So overall, I would expect to hear that narrative a lot moving forward. In fact, part of the reason that I was inspired to take this as the topic for this episode was due to a cycle of previews that we saw in Dominaria United that kind of sparked that debate again. I'm talking about the Lord cycle. So there is a cycle of rares in Dominaria United that are all like 2 mana creatures. Maybe the mana values are different, but they're all dorky creatures that pump a certain creature type, and then they have an extra ability tacked on. And it's a classic case of the white one being so significantly worse than the other ones that it just made people spark up that conversation again. White never gets anything, right? The white one's like a soldier lord that gives +1/+1 counters from the graveyard, whereas the other one's like draw a bunch of cards and can counter spells and stuff like that. The black one gets to like just tutor black creatures from your library and put it into play, which is kind of funny how big the delta between the power level of those cards is. And the white one's just, generic white thing. Pumps your soldiers, puts counters on your soldiers. It does what all the other white cards in Magic do. So yeah, we had to hear that come back up, and I imagine this will come up anytime we get a cycle of cards where some of the cards are good, and like the white one is just noticeably worse. Fingers crossed that whenever we get our Elish Norn card that it's actually playable, because we'll never hear the end of it if we get a bad Elish Norn whenever she decides to show up in the next coming sets, but I can't believe they'll mess that one up. They've done pretty good with the second cycle of Praetors here. I think Elish Norn is going to be fine. But anyway, that's my 2 cents on the question of whether or not white is viable in Commander again. My answer, yeah, it's doing fine. It's got a lot of good cards now. It's got a lot of good options, and R&D has shown a tenacity to give it things that make it a contender in Commander. I think they're actively trying to make white a little bit more diverse and a little bit more powerful compared to the other colors. that is going to do it. I do want to mention before we leave that Jank Diver Gaming is a cube-related community. We have a Discord, which you can find links to down below in the description. That's where we organize all of our cube events. You can come cube with us on Arena on Wednesdays and Sundays. You can even walk away with some gems. If you end up in the top half, it's completely free. You get to hang out with people. While you're here, subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can see more episodes of Scattered Thoughts. You can find some draft videos that myself and some of our community members have been doing. Pocket Dave has recently released his first draft video. He's getting his feet wet in the world of content creation, and we've posted his video on the YouTube channel. So you can subscribe here for more content like this. You can find us in the Discord to come cube with us, but that is going to do it for Scattered Thoughts today. As always, thanks for hanging out. This is episode 4. My name is Timothy Zaccanino with Jank Diver Gaming, and I will see you all next time.